All right, here we go with section 4. Jefferson Davis proved unable to rally the Southern public behind the war. Although eloquent, Davis, a West Point graduate, senator, and Mississippi plantation owner, lacked charisma and ability to connect with ordinary citizens. The Confederacy's lack of a party system also was a liability, as Southern leaders saw parties as a danger to national unity. Davis thus lacked a counterpart to the well organized Republican Party, which organized support for Lincoln's administration. Under Davis, the South's government became very centralized, raising armies, taking control of railroads, and building factories. But the Confederate government never effectively utilized the South's main economic resource, cotton. A strategy to focus on food production as a means to compel Great Britain, whose mills used Southern cotton, to side with the Confederacy failed. Other nations increased their cotton production, such as Egypt and India, which helped produce a crisis of overproduction after the war when Southern cotton production resumed. Nor did Davis deal effectively with obstructionist governors like Joseph E. Brown of Georgia, who opposed the draft as an infringement of states' rights. Social change and internal strife consumed the South as the war dragged on. Initially, white Southerners widely supported the Confederate cause and war effort, claiming the war was being fought to protect liberty against Northern tyranny. Yet public disaffection grew, especially over the draft, which allowed substitutes and exempted one white male for every 20 enslaved people on a plantation, thus releasing from service many overseers and planters' sons and greatly increasing opposition to the war among poor whites. Economic crisis also caused inner turmoil in the South. As the blockade became more effective, more of the South became occupied by Union forces, and slave productivity declined. Shortages of essential goods became widespread. Confederate policies that seemed to favor the wealthy and large slave owners exacerbated the effects of economic troubles, as poor whites felt they faced unequal burdens. While the Confederacy, like the North, borrowed heavily to finance the war, the planter-dominated Congress would not levy heavy taxes that planters would have to pay. Instead, it printed an enormous amount of paper money, even more than the greenbacks printed by the North. Congress authorized military officers to seize goods and pay citizens with this money, which became increasingly worthless. Many Southerners resented this practice. In some cities, food riots broke out. By the end of the war, nearly 100,000 men, mostly poor non-slaveholders, had deserted from the Confederate Army. By 1864, organized movements calling for peace surfaced in several Southern states, and secret societies were actively promoting disloyalty. Confederate military tribunals imprisoned Unionists, drove them from their homes, and executed a few. By the end of the war, about 50,000 white Southerners fought for the Union. One of the most celebrated Union heroes of the war was Elizabeth Van Lew of Richmond, who convinced her family to free their slaves in 1843, helped to supply Union prisoners of war, and assisted some in escape. A former enslaved woman of the Van Lew family, Mary Elizabeth Bowser, obtained information as a servant in the Southern White House, which Van Lew then passed to Union forces. More than in the North, the war imposed many costs on women in the South. Often left alone on farms and plantations, women had to take over men's responsibilities to conduct business and discipline slaves. Southern women organized to support soldiers and engaged in previously male occupations. Government girls worked as clerks in the Confederate government. Many, in the absence of slave labor or their husbands, found it increasingly difficult to feed their families, petitioned the government for assistance, not as charity but as a right, and forced state governments to begin distributing supplies to needy families. While Southern women's contribution to the war was legendary, more women came to believe that the war was not worth the sacrifices they were making. Women's disaffection helped decrease civilian morale and fostered desertion from the army. Increasing shortages of white manpower led the Confederate government to authorize the arming of enslaved people to fight on the South's behalf, an event no one could have foreseen at the start of the war. Many slaveholders resisted it, and the Confederate Senate rejected it. The Confederate Congress approved the measure only in March 1865 when Robert E. Lee endorsed it. The war ended before substantial enlistment began, but Confederate forces did employ blacks, mostly enslaved, as laborers. The South's decision to raise black troops illustrates how the war undermined not only slavery, but also the pro-slavery ideology. Howell Cobb of Georgia stated, "If slaves make good soldiers, our whole theory of slavery is wrong." So that was our fourth section. We'll be back with the fifth.